we'll talk about a lot of details, and we'll open it up to the audience in a moment to do that. But let me start with a very broad, overarching political question, which you answered implicitly, but is so important I want to ask it explicitly. You mentioned earlier in your remarks, as we all know, that the entire European project, and the Euro project more recently, was born of that historical sense that Europe had to live together or it would again die separately. During this latest crisis, as you well know, a lot of people ask whether that spirit was still alive. Were German taxpayers really willing to help Greek pensioners? Did the advent of a generation that did not experience the Second World War mean that the memories of Europe's past division were too far in the past to animate political cooperation and a continuation of the European spirit? And therefore the question whether the European project had reached its zenith. And even when you came up with the crisis responses effectively as you did, questions lingered as to whether the forward momentum of the project would continue, whether the underlying political sensitivities in each of the major countries, particularly some of the most important core countries, would continue to place European integration at the forefront of policy. So as you draw lessons from this incredibly hectic and tumultuous experience that you personally and your colleagues in Europe have been through, what lessons do you draw in answering that rather critical and overarching question?
Thank you, Fred. I think you touch upon a major political point. Let me start by saying that Europe is not a dinosaur in a museum. Europe is a living animal. And any living animal goes through stages and phases of its existence. And every living animal, and particularly humans, tend to try to learn lessons from previous experiences and build upon those lessons. I think Europe is that. Europe is as perfect as any human being in its capacity to address the problems, to anticipate the problems, and to move forward. So I think we are sometimes, beginning with Europeans, too harsh in our assessment of Europe. Of course, Europe today is different from the Europe of the 50s, 60s, 70s. Of course, the leaders are different from the leaders of those times. The leaders are elected by voters, so they reflect the feelings of the voters. I mean, this idea that leaders can consistently and constantly pull electors behind them is less and less true as democracy becomes more perfect, or less perfect, depending on the assessments we make. But anyway, as democratic process progress. So I'm relatively serene about the way I look at Europe, because I know that I have to look at it as a living animal, evolving, progressing. I think what we need to do is to be realistic, to be frank and serious about the way we assess the problem. And if you ask me if it was easy to convince Mrs. Merkel to align immediately with a number of ideas, I mean, I'm not going to say no, because everybody knows that the debate took place. And Mrs. Merkel did not shy away from that debate. She assumed perfectly that she had problems, doubts, and the discussion took place. The problem with Europe is that because we are 27, and because we are 27 democracies, and because for journalists, with 27 delegations in the room, it's the easiest job in the world to have a good quote, to know exactly what happened. So our debates are totally transparent. I mean, you heard the reports about the European Council this week, and everybody seems to know what Mr. Sarkozy told Mr. Barroso about the Roms and vice versa. We are it's a glass building. So we all know what's happened there. With 27, we need to have a debate. So I will try to not minimize what you said, but assume it as a given reality. Europe today is different than a few years ago. What I tried to explain a while ago is that having in mind all these constraints, all these differences, we are able to progress. And if you look historically in retrospective, and if you see the history of Europe and the different crises we had, in fact, we have much more serious crises in the beginning of the European projects. The French left the empty chair. President de Gaulle would not go to, or any other minister of France will go to meetings. They simply walked out because of serious divergence of views. We refused Britain to come in at one point. And I could name a number of other crises, which, again, I go back. All of us have crises in our lives, the midlife crisis, the teenager crisis. I don't know which one Europe is for you to judge, but there's always a crisis, and we try to address and we try to move forward. So I agree with you that there are changes. I agree with you that there are changes in important countries of the Union. We need to incorporate them. We need to address them and find always the next level of consensus. That's what Europe is about. That's what it's so fascinating about it. It's sometimes difficult to understand, but I think that what we've done with this crisis proves that we are still alive and kicking and not dying, as I see written sometimes here in the American press.
Let me ask you a more economic question to maybe help set the framework for answering the big political question going forward. You talked about lessons from the crisis, reforms in European governance, in setting safety nets for the future. But you did not talk very much about getting Europe back on a rapid growth path. And I presume that one of the tests that the European Union will undergo in the eyes of those electorates, not to mention national political leaders, is whether it helps provide a sustained recovery from the crisis in the sense of getting back on a growth path. As I indicated in my opening remarks, both Europe and the United States are lagging. We had a burst of growth toward the end of last year, but that's now slowed down. You have had some relatively good growth numbers the last quarter, a pickup that was surprising in many quarters, but you had a crisis only 6 months ago, and many people feel your growth will slow down again. So we're kind of in that together in a world where Asia is booming and the emerging markets more broadly are booming. So talk a little bit about the European strategy for restoring more robust economic growth, bringing down your unemployment rate. How do you see the global economy affecting that, your key role in the global economy, which you did mention, but talk a bit about how Europe, in your vision, in managing the Union, is going to deal with that more lasting problem to come out of the crisis and restore a robust economic profile, which would then presumably help recapture political support throughout the Union.
I think, Fred, this is the real problem. I mean, this is the heart of the matter. And this is where we should focus ourselves, politicians first of all, but also economic operators and others. Because I wanted to spare you a far too long speech, I skipped a couple of pages on that. So that's why it may have looked a little unbalanced. But I come back to my first point. This is the central issue. But not only for the European Union. It's, I believe, if I may, the central issue for the United States, as much as it is for the global community. What we did in the G20, came out of Pittsburgh last year, was a clear indication that once we have stabilized markets, once we have dealt with the crisis as such, which I think we largely did in the G20 context, we should not lose momentum and address immediately the issue of how do we maintain growth, how do we ensure a sustainable path towards a sustainable growth. And this is what I think was slightly overlooked in the work of the G20. And it is much more difficult to do that than to respond to the crisis. Because you don't have the pressure. You don't have the momentum that is created by an emergency. You have an urgency of dealing with, markets falling apart, all we lived through in the past 2 years. It's much more difficult to focus attention of politicians on structural reforms. It doesn't get you votes immediately. Rather, it may make you lose votes. Prime Minister of Luxembourg, who was also the president of the Euro group, said, and rightly so, we all know what we need to do. What we don't know is how to be re-elected after having done what we need to do. And this is the problem. And if I may refer to the G20, well, I'm no longer Sherpa since Toronto, but I still worked as European Union Sherpa for the Toronto Summit. And what I feel, if you ask me, and even if you don't ask, I'll say it, I think that there is a risk if we don't all focus and invest intensively in the agenda you just put out inside the G20, there is a risk that the G20 loses momentum. So I think it's a duty of all of us, because I believe the G20 is the best instrument we have today to find global solutions for the need for a sustainable growth of the world economy. There is an urgent need for the G20 to focus with full political momentum, as it did to address the crisis, on the way we need to ensure recovery. As far as Europe is concerned, I think we are aware of that. I mentioned the strategy Europe 2020, which aims at 10 years period. It is linked also with other elements. We try to bring an holistic view of things, the strictly economic dimension, the environmental climate dimension. But if there is one element that strikes me in Europe 2020 is competitiveness/innovation dimension. This is where, if Europe, but I think this is largely true for the United States, if we want to preserve or even enhance our role in the future world economy, this is where we need to focus. For that, you need to reform. For that, you need to take painful decisions. Look at the pension system and the reforms and how many people it brings to the streets in Europe. Look at the fundamental issue of fiscal sustainability and the cost it has in political terms when you cut down public expenditure and all that. So I think, in a nutshell, this is the only important question this moment, or the most important question, but it's at the same time the most difficult one from a political point of view. And thirdly, it's something we cannot achieve in isolation, nor Germany, nor Britain alone, not the European Union alone, not the United States alone. There's nothing the industrialized world can do to ensure that if the emerging economies don't participate, don't contribute, don't share the responsibility.
Let me ask you one final question, then we open it to the group. And it follows right on from your comments about the G20 and the last remark in your prepared statement about the need for transatlantic cooperation. Without being too radical, I think one could say there are three differences, or at least potential differences, between the US and Europe on key economic and G20 issues. One is the macroeconomic question. You touched on that. Is it time to continue to stimulate, or is it time to consolidate? And as you know, some on this side of the Atlantic have criticized you on your side of the Atlantic for a program that some have called concerted fiscal austerity, even by countries like Germany that maybe didn't quite need it, as gauged by the markets. So question one, stimulate versus consolidate, is that a transatlantic difference? Secondly, on the financial regulatory reform, as just came out of Basel over the weekend, that seemed to be widely agreed, but we know there are some differences between the US and at least some of the continental European countries on key aspects of that, capital requirements, how fast to phase them in, et cetera. And third, there's an ongoing, fairly high-profile debate about reform of the IMF, the governance structure there, the representation there, the need to reduce the role of some of overrepresented countries in favor of some underrepresented countries. Those three areas are all, to some or greater degree, transatlantic differences. Do you regard them as significant differences, ones that will be hard to resolve, or do you see that as kind of the normal give and take, and at the end of the day, we'll be able to come to agreements on them, most immediately for the G20 in Seoul in November, but in a more fundamental sense, as we do try to come out of the economic crisis in a sustainable way?
Well, very interesting points. I was referring to the Union being a living animal or even a human. I mean, if you take the United States and Europe, maybe you can think of a couple. And of course, couples have differences as well, here and there. Most of the time, they come to consensus. Sometimes they have to have longer discussions, but the purpose and the approach is one of trying to reach consensus and having a common project. A couple of comments on the issue of fiscal consolidation against stimulus. I think, but I'm not an economist, so I take it from a slightly more political angle. I think this is an artificial debate, fundamentally, and that we should rather look at what we have in common rather than what we have as a difference among ourselves. And what I see today is that we are on both sides of the Atlantic doing both fiscal consolidation and promoting growth. And in fact, what we're doing is a growth-friendly consolidation. And this is the synthesis we agree that in the G20. If I look at the IMF report on the euro area, they say that our approach is broadly correct. They take in consideration individual situation in given countries, and they come to a broad assessment of it being correct. If I look at the recent forecasts from the European Commission on European growth, they have been revised upwards substantially. So, at the same time, we are very serious, and our governments are extremely serious, and I mentioned a few cases in my speech where people are taking tough, severe, drastic measures to address the issue of fiscal sustainability. And we will remain on that path because we believe this is a condition for credibility and for sustainability in the future. As far as the financial regulation is concerned, I've been in debates here about this. Again, it's the kind of debate where you see is the glass half full or half empty in terms of convergence of what we do. I don't think the glass will ever be totally full. And maybe there is no need for the glass to be totally full. Do we need totally homogeneous financial regulation across the Atlantic? I don't think so. There is a debate about subsidiarity and all. And I think it's a good, interesting debate. So maybe the glass doesn't need to be totally full. What I say is two things. One, we are doing better today than before the crisis? Yes. Are we more convergent today than before the crisis? Yes. Are we taking initiatives that are largely compatible? Yes. So for me, the glass is half full and not half empty. And the other thing I would say is that maybe instead of looking obsessively towards the differences among the two of us, we should rather look at how the two of us can have an impact on the others. Because if we waste time, maybe others will tell us what we should do. So I think there is a case for increased and improved transatlantic cooperation in designing how the economy should look like, or the systems of regulation, supervision, and you name it, the way we regulate globalization in 10 or 20 years' time looks like, instead of focusing excessively on the differences we may have. On the IMF reform, there is an ongoing debate. Maybe some of us would have liked some of our partners to have acted in a slightly different way. To put it mildly, there is also a debate about, don't hide it, about how Europe should be represented in international organizations like this one. But that's another debate. I think my concern today would be that we find a compromise, that we find a solution that would not block us inside the IMF. We have a framework decided within the G20. We have to deliver on that set of concepts and solutions, but I don't think we should, at this point in time, be blocked as we are, and I would urge a compromise to appear to sort us out of this situation along, or as we, in parallel, reflect, work together to find the right solutions that we are committed to implement when in the framework of the G20.
Okay, the floor is open. Let me invite questions, comments, observations on what we've heard. Please introduce yourself. Either use the hand mic here or go to the standing mic in the back and fire away. Jacob.
Jacob Kierkegaard from the Peterson Institute. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for your very thoughtful remarks. You mentioned that U.S. taxpayers should not worry because of the IMF contribution to the Greek assistance package, which obviously a loan that will be repaid under assumed to be repaid. But I wanted to ask you that today there was a rumor in the press which cited IMF sources that said that the 3-year expiration date on the current joint IMF-EU program for Greece did not in itself, shouldn't lead to the assumption that future assistance packages could be ruled out with respect to IMF participation. So my question to you is, does that also, and what are your thoughts, could we make similar assumptions with respect to future EU or Eurozone assistance at some point in the future after the expiration of the current Greek package?
There is a rule in politics, which I've come across in my career. Never speak about a plan B when plan A is still being implemented. So I will not violate that rule. And I will certainly not dare comment on rumors coming out of the IMF. It's too risky for me to do. What I can tell you, and I repeat, is that I believe we are on the right track as far as the Greek situation is concerned. Enormous praise for the Greek authorities, also for the Greek people that are enduring a difficult period and difficult measures. We are all behind Greece in the efforts they are providing, and we are fully confident that they will be successful.
Question in the back.
Hi, Lisa Gomi with the Yomiuri Shimbun, a Japanese daily newspaper. I had 2 questions regarding Asia. So first of all, in this past week, there have been a lot of talks, especially in Congress, about using the G20 as a framework to talk about the renminbi, the Chinese yuan, and as a possible venue for discussing further action on that. I was wondering what you thought about that proposal, especially implications for the EU. And second, earlier this week, Japan intervened to prevent the yen from further deflating. And I was wondering what you also thought about that, if you could speak on those 2 points.
Okay, on the yen, I've quoted Mr. Juncker on something else a while ago, and I need to refer to Mr. Juncker again, because on exchange rate matters, the euro area speaks through the mouth of Mr. Juncker. So he has made remarks about the yen. I totally subscribe his remarks, and I don't wish to comment any further. About the issue of China's currency and the G20, let me remind you, as I was saying earlier, that G20 leaders, which of course include Chinese leaders, have committed themselves to a framework for strong, sustainable, and balanced growth. In order to achieve this, countries with large external surpluses, like China, have pledged to undertake reforms to reduce their reliance on exports, and increase domestic demand. This is what the G20 is committed to do. This is what the countries of the G20 are committed to do. The recent move by China to a more flexible exchange rate regime is welcome, but we share the view that a more rapid appreciation of the currency would be appropriate, and this has been said in different occasions. But I want to stress that within the G20 response to the crisis, China played overall a constructive role with its contribution to the global response to this crisis.
Let me just follow briefly on that, if I might, in part because I spent 7 hours during the last 2 days before 2 congressional committees talking about the China currency issue. And one of the interesting aspects of that congressional discussion is how the congressmen, perhaps surprising to some of our friends around the world, are strongly advocating a multilateral approach to the issue. They're not looking for some bilateral or unilateral U.S. effort. Their hope is that the multilateral process will work and that the G20 framework will pan out. Within that context, some of them were asking a question I'd like to ask you. The U.S. and Europe have pretty similar interests, I think, and views about the Chinese currency, namely, it's been manipulated, it's been suppressed, it should be permitted to strengthen greatly. Has there been, in your judgment, sufficient cooperation, even coordination, between the U.S. and the EU, with this common interest, I think, to promote a constructive outcome within the multilateral processes on the China currency issue? I raise that in part because in the recent IMF discussion of China's economy, the Article 4 discussions, which were pretty widely publicized, only 5 or 6 of the executive directors seem to be together in seeking significant Chinese reform. Since Europe alone has 8 seats, that means at least some Europeans did not come in on that side of the debate. But my broader point, are we as transatlantic allies and friends, and seemingly with very similar interests on this one, are we working together effectively?
Let me reply in slightly larger terms. I think that the potential for EU-US cooperation is huge. We are doing a lot already, but we believe we can do more. We can do more on different fronts. One is the pure bilateral. I think there's a lot more we can do on the transatlantic marketplace and creating conditions for job creation and growth in our economies, out of regulatory convergence, breaking down non-tariff barriers, all of that. But there is a potential for us, the two of us, Europe and the US, to work together to address world challenges. We've started doing that in the G20, it's very important, but I think that bilaterally, the two of us, maybe there's more we can do to address some of the issues we discuss inside the G20 on a bilateral basis. Some of the issues you mentioned could be included in such a dialogue. If you talk about China, and I have a European business complaining or highlighting some difficulties of market access to China, I'm sure the American businessman has exactly the same problems. I don't think these problems affect differently Europeans and Americans. And maybe we should discuss more about this. And we should approach Chinese authorities and government also on these issues. So I think there is scope for us to talk more among ourselves and to engage more in not only bilaterally dimension of the problems, but the global dimension.
Yes.
Yes, I was wondering if you could expand.
Could you identify?
Oh, yes, I'm Kim Frankena. I'm with the U.S. Government Accountability Office. And I wanted to see if you could expand on the Europe 2020 concept. Who developed it, and what is going to happen to it?
Well, the initial proposals came from the European Commission. at the start of the mandate, the second mandate of President Barroso. It's now being discussed, approved. The large framework has been approved by the member states, and it's now being implemented by European institutions, member states on their own. As I said, it's an holistic approach to economic growth. It has a strong structural reform dimension. It has a strong research, innovation, competitiveness track. It tries to incorporate also the environmental and climate dimension. We have forgotten a little bit the climate change debate for reasons that have to do with the lack of momentum in Copenhagen, but the world is still the same. The problems are still the same. We are only just putting them aside for a moment, but we will have to see all this in. So Europe 2020 brings together the environmental climate dimension with all the other aspects that are raised. I can, and my colleagues can brief you more bilaterally if you want. It's an extremely interesting process, but as I said earlier, these are the most difficult decisions because they imply important reforms in the way we organize our societies.
Final question, Nick.
Nick Lardy, Peterson Institute. Mr. Ambassador, in your remarks, you touched on the problem of diverging international competitiveness within the EU and the need for structural reforms that would address that. I'm wondering if you could expand on that and tell us precisely what reforms you think are necessary, and in your answer, if you could give us some idea about the time frame in which you think it might be possible to address this question, that would be great.
Well, the issue is on the table right now. I mean, what we're doing, if you look at the entirety of things we're doing, on the one hand, we're trying to design a strategy. When Europe 2020 is overall a strategy for Europe to ensure sustainable, environmentally friendly growth by 2020, which is aligned with the same agenda we have for climate change and other issues. So this is the framework. Then we are doing what I've described earlier about economic governance, bringing together different tracks of economic policy and policy formulation in member states in a coherent way by creating all these mechanisms of coordination inside the Union around this. So at the end of the day, what we're looking forward is to have a better integration of economic policies, particularly inside the Economic and Monetary Union, better mechanisms of governance, structural reform in our economies. What structural reforms? The one you know. I mean, we need to change the labor market. We need to address all the issues of competitiveness of our companies. This is at the core of where we are. The issue of research. You know, there is a gap towards our other partners, including the United States, in terms of our capacity to innovate, our capacity to translate research into the marketplace. All of these are fundamentally structural reforms that we need to implement. Education. I mean, see where our universities are today as compared to the American ones. We have to catch up. We have to catch up there. And, you know, I could go on. But again, this is the fundamental issue. This is where we should concentrate fully our political capital. But it is, at the same time, the most difficult one.
Mr. Ambassador, as you indicated, and as you and your colleagues well know, we here at the Institute do an enormous amount of work on Europe and the European Union. We did a big project, you referred to that, on the euro at 5. We did another one on the euro at 10. We have a major conference coming next month, just before the IMF meetings, on some of the current transatlantic issues. It's a great pleasure to do that. We regard it as at the very top of the global economic priority list. And we thank you very much for coming to visit us so soon after your arrival here, for sharing with us your wisdom and your experience on so many of these topics. We look forward to working very closely with you, as with your colleagues, and keeping a very close watch on all these developments going forward. Thank you for joining us, and congratulations on a superb presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Meeting adjourned.